Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Sessions, our podcast here at Embark. I am just so privileged and super excited. I've known we're going to do this interview for a while, and I've been doing some research and just catching up. And I'm just, like I said, ecstatic to have Dr. George Slavich with us today to spend some time with us and to share in his story. Dr. Slavich is certainly a renowned professor at UCLA for psychiatry and biobehavioral science. We're going to get him to talk about him being the founding director of the Stress Assessment and Research Lab, also at UCLA. But before all that, Dr. Slavich, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast.
Rob, thank you so much. And I'm a huge fan of what Embark is doing. And I think, in this time and age, the world needs all the help that it can get to manage mental health and stay resilient. So it's just a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about that today.
Well, great. Well, as excited as I am to talk about stress and all of your work, I did want to say that as a side note, being a little bit, certainly given my age, I was looking through some of your publications, and one that stood out to me, I smiled, and it said 50 years of giving psychology away, an interview with Philip Zimbardo. And even though it's written back in 2009, I wanted to ask you, like, oh my gosh, what was that like?
So the backstory is that I was lucky enough to do my undergraduate at Stanford. I'm a Bay Area kid, born and raised. So, I traveled a whole 25 minutes away to college. It wasn't that far.
Yeah.
At that time, that was early 2000s, late 1990s. And Phil Zimbardo was one of the biggest guys on campus. I mean, his introductory to psychology class would, fill up in 7 seconds after it was made available on the course registrar's website.
Yeah.
Zimbardo's an amazing guy. I mean, he studied shyness and mind control and obedience to authority, and he's really his work is much broader than just the Stanford prison experiment. But long story short, I took several courses from him, ended up being a teaching assistant from him, and I think the most indelible impact that he's had on my own work in life is that transfer of content to students is really important, but it's not going to be as important as making other people really excited about learning and about research. Because if you can make them excited about learning and research, that's something that they can take with them and go off and make a career of their own, whether or not it's in the same thing that you study or not. And, I still fondly remember him saying, the most important thing for us to do as teaching assistants is to get students engaged, passionate, and excited.
Wow.
It reminds me of sort of the NC2A advertisements. It's like most of us will, turn professional in something other than sports. I think that's Phil's approach to teaching. It's like most Stanford students will go pro in something other than psychology, right? And so the best thing that you can do for a student is really to instill in them, a thirst for learning, passion, excitement. And that has just really stuck with me.
Well, it struck me. I don't know if other people have I was like, oh my gosh. And so I opened it up, and I had no idea that said that actually him and Stanley Milgram were actually classmates in high school.
There are so many wild stories. I mean, him and Stanley Milgram were classmates, in the Bronx together. Zimbardo moved almost 40 times before he graduated from high school because he grew up in poverty with no TV in his house, living above a laundromat. Almost died from double pneumonia at age 6, the days before penicillin. So his own personal story is really one of strength and resilience, and I think, and as you said at the top, just giving his work away.
Yeah. Well, it sounded like that profoundly affected you in such an amazing way. But if I can ask, I know this to many of our listeners, they'll be certainly psychologists and therapists themselves, looking for a deeper understanding is why I love to do this. So thank you for sharing your story, but in a similar way, if you don't mind sharing us, you mentioned being from the Bay Area. What was your early life like, and how did that shape your goals of psychology, teaching? If you don't mind sharing with us, it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, and some of not to compare myself to Zimbardo, but as I've learned over the years, there's some similar elements around shyness, and too, that
Oh,
I'll try to talk about. But no, I mean, I grew up in as only child. My parents immigrated from Croatia, and I was, let's say, painfully shy growing up. I remember not feeling confident enough to ask to be able to go to the bathroom in preschool.
right.
I just couldn't get the courage to approach people. I just couldn't sort of tolerate the anxiety. It was really pretty bad, and uh, I suppose I funneled my efforts into things that I could control and that were sort of predictable. So work and school are good places to focus your efforts if you're a shy kid, because you can sort of put your head down, close the door, put your head down, and just work on whatever it is that you feel passionate about.
Right.
And I still remember in college having, studying for tests and just having so much anxiety that, it felt like I was almost causing ulcers for myself. And, it was never debilitating, not like that, but I certainly felt that it was something that I didn't, it was not pleasurable, let's say. Uh, and then, at some point the pain just becomes too much, and I should speak for myself, decided to try to do something about it, and go a little bit easier on myself and take
Mhm.
some chances. And the funny thing about being shy, which Zimbardo also talks about in his 1976 book about shyness, is that shy people essentially are prisoners of their own minds.
Oh,
So a lot of links between the shyness work and the Stanford prison experiment work. But essentially, if you're a shy kid, you don't lean into the world. You have thoughts that other people don't like you or won't accept you, or that you'll make a fool of yourself, that you'll say something stupid, and those thoughts prevent you from testing those hypotheses. You don't engage in social relationships. You don't go and approach people at parties. And other shy people probably will resonate with me when I say this, is that you never put those beliefs to the test, right? You never approach somebody and then have the experience that it went well. And therefore, if you don't have the experience that it went well, you never have the opportunity to revise the belief that it wouldn't have gone well. And so, yeah, long story short, I grew up as a shy kid and didn't quite shake that until college, and have just been trying to lean into social relationships ever since.
wow. I appreciate this so much. And I can't help but ask, certainly with your acumen and all your research and your personal experience, what would you say for those couching it as shyness? What is the ultimate fear? Because you're like, boy, that just being afraid that they're not going to like you. If we unpack that, what is the fear underneath?
My gosh. I mean, at a very fundamental level, fear for me assumes some amount of cognition about the thoughts. I mean, for me in the beginning, it's really about temperament. I mean, I was too young to sort of think about obviously what fear meant, or, you just feel inhibited, and I
Mm,
and I'm talking about like when I was, I don't know, 3, 4, and 5,
yeah.
you feel like you are not socially safe. You don't feel like you can approach. You don't feel like you have necessarily a voice. You don't really know how to use your voice because you haven't had the opportunity to practice it quite enough. So, when you get older, it sort of, for me, became explicit thoughts like other people won't, like you, other people will laugh at you, those kinds of things. But I think early on, it's not so explicit. Early on,
Mm.
it's just really feeling inhibited.
And we could expound forever. I don't mean to
Yeah,
get
we can
caught in
do an
this. It
hour
just
on shyness. For me, it's fascinating, to think about how it can change your life life course, right?
For sure. And as you know, just in my own field of, of my career, it's been one of attachment focused. So I'm thinking, wow, I wonder how this insecurity how does that relate to some attachment? Is there a connection? And how does shame play a factor? You know what I'm saying? My mind is really going along the continuum.
All of those things. I mean, for me, I felt very securely attached to my parents. I don't think it came from there, although my mom is more, let's say, introverted than my dad is. My dad is very outward and gregarious. My dad is a little more introverted. But when you're 3 years old, you haven't done a ton of social learning yet. A lot of it's also just genetic predisposition, and I suppose that's what mine was. But us shy people have superheroes, and so I think what I've tried to do in my career is superpowers, I should say. And I think I suppose my career and my scholarly work is just about finding how that social sensitivity can be flipped into a strength instead of a weakness. And so I think some of that is represented in my work, and certainly the types of things that I study. And as the joke saying goes, research is me search, and I think there's a little bit of truth in that if you look at the things that I focus on.
Yeah, I noticed one of the well, more than one, but one that I noticed was really talking about the social impact of stress and health and how that impacts. And so you must be a living example of a case study, if you will, of being more social, and interpersonal healthiness is really connected.
Yeah, the social, and I can't claim to have experienced that much, true adversity in my life. I'm very lucky in that sense. But overcoming, as Zimbardo would say, sort of being a prisoner of our own mind, is in and of itself a challenge that I think resonates with a lot of folks.
So thank you so much, and I'm curious. So you grew up in the Bay Area. Maybe the shyness is related, but you certainly must have been performing academically, had a focus in order to say, "Hey, I'm going a couple minutes down the road to Stanford." That in itself is a pretty good accomplishment.
Yeah, and my life, I think, and a lot of our lives, whether we recognize it or not, is some combination of being hardworking and being prepared. That again, is saying, chance favors the prepared mind or the prepared person. And again, just to talk about my own personal experience, I wasn't a great student in elementary school and in middle school. I'm young for my class age. My birthday's in September, so at least in California, I'm right on the cusp of whether you sort of start early or wait a year, and that probably also has something to do with whether or not the shyness was compounded over time. But long story short, I joined a swim team in high school. It was a really small swim team. We had 6 swimmers only. And one of those people on the swim team was just an incredible role model. And he happened to be a senior and was preparing. And then during the swim season, found out that he was going to Stanford. And I was really curious to learn more about what that looks like. And he just seemed like he had his life so well put together. And also sort of preparing yourself for something in the future felt very controllable and sort of predictable to me. And he just had a huge influence on my mind, on my own approach, and really sort of taught me what it would take, to have a chance to get in, to a school like that. And just obviously on a swim team, you have a lot of time to ask people questions. You're going through the season together, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's what I mean about the serendipitous part, is that, I easily could have focused on something else if it wouldn't just off chance had been that I met him. And, he really taught me a lot about what it meant to sort of prepare yourself in a scholarly way. Fast forward to Stanford, and I grew up in a business family. My parents were owned and operated a hardware store when I was growing up. So since age 3 or 4, I was, sounds ridiculous, but mixing paint, cutting glass, threading pipe, all the things you do in a hardware store. It was honestly best sort of socialization and fun that, a kid could have. And when I got to Stanford, I really thought I was gonna be a business major. Well, again, sort of as chance intervened, Stanford didn't have a business major. They have an economics major, and so I took, introductory to economics and absolutely hated it. It wasn't about the graphs wasn't what got me excited. It turns out that wasn't the part of business that I really enjoyed. It was really sort of the psychology of business and people, and I suppose marketing at that time point. In any case, I had a great friend in my dorm who was taking an introductory to psychology course at the time. And I said, what the heck? I don't know anything about psychology. I never had psychology in high school. What I do know is that economics is not where it's at for me. Stanford doesn't have a business undergrad, so it's not going to be business. So I'll try something different. I took introductory to psychology, and I had the experience that I didn't want to read anything from my econ textbooks. And when I opened up my psychology textbooks, I couldn't stop reading. Wow. And the biggest joy in life, I think, is to just find something that you love so much that it doesn't feel like work. And that's what it was for me. So again, I would not have ever, gotten to Stanford if I wasn't prepared. But if you want to put the pieces together, I could never say that I ended up with this particular career because I was somehow preparing myself for a career in psychology or clinical psychology. All of that is totally attributable to these chance events of, Stanford not having a major, me meeting somebody else in my dorm who introduced me to something that I just happened to fall in love with and doing well in it. And I suppose also that topic being a particularly good match for my DNA helps.
It's so fascinating. So very advantageous how things worked out. You use the term serendipitous. It's so wonderful. So you're in college and you start focusing it. I assume at some point in time you make it your major and you really harness that. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear. You're getting towards the latter part of college. What's the plan for you?
So that, just to put this sort of on a chronological timeline, I was an undergrad from 1996 to 2000, and I did a master's at Stanford in 2001. So I was there from 1996 to 2001, and incredible time to be at Stanford. So the 1996 on the earlier side of things was Yahoo, Netscape, really the first moments of the internet coming to life in the Bay Area, but also I think worldwide, right. Graphic web browsers, AOL, those things. Around 1997, 1998 was the beginning of Google. And, the Google founders, the first search engine some of your listeners might know was, google.stanford.edu. They were graduate students at Stanford, right? So the whole PageRank system and figuring out the DNA that ultimately became Google was all done at Stanford. And it was, you would be sitting at a lunch or dinner table and hearing people talk about the dot-com industry and them selling their company to Yahoo for $30 million and these crazy stories. And I really didn't know. I suppose it was just a 50-50 chance, being from the Bay Area. Do I sort of go and try to get a job at Google or Yahoo or one of these companies just down the road? Or do I do an honors thesis and, try to take my stab at putting an independent research project together? I suppose your listeners can be the judges of whether I chose wisely or not.
I say yes emphatically. You chose right.
So, it was probably 51% do the honors thesis and go to graduate school and make a career out of that versus 49% sort of take my interest in psychology and apply it, to health tech in some way. And the 51% won out. So I did my honors thesis, graduated with honors, and then at the time happened to be doing a honors thesis with a wonderful professor at Stanford, Ian Gottlieb, who was collaborating with an amazing gentleman at the University of Oregon, Scott Monroe, at the time. And so then the transition to the University of Oregon and becoming an Oregon Duck was sort of an easy decision for me, since my soon to be advisor at Oregon was already a known quantity to me, and also being, I suppose, only child wanting to stay a little bit closer to my parents, the West Coast felt very attractive.
Yeah. Can I ask, just because I have it, what was the dissertation title?
Yeah, cognitive mechanisms of stress sensitization, which feels a little bit like a mouthful. I'm glad I could remember it, so thanks for the memory check on that one. But the basic idea there is, we know that if each individual person, if they come to experience a major life stressor like a divorce or getting fired, there are different thresholds that will put each of us over the edge and lead that stressor to turn into a depressive episode or anxiety episode. And I was really curious, what is it that sort of lowers the threshold for somebody to become depressed, once they're faced with a major life event? And that dissertation really focused on something that the cognitive behavior therapists in the audience will know a lot about, which is negative thoughts, dysfunctional thoughts and attitudes, negative core beliefs, and how it is that our thoughts and our perceptions of ourselves, other people, and the future can really, make certain individuals to become more vulnerable to, in the parlance of the dissertation, sort of sensitize us to stressors when they occur, that then allows a major life event to turn into a depressive episode for one person, whereas it might not for another.
So fascinating. And I mean, obviously, I don't want to jump ahead, but boy, studying stress has been a continual, even though there's a plethora of, I mean, you've expanded your scope of research. It's tremendous. It's just, I know that this concept of stress has been a variable throughout your work.
Yeah, and that felt like a harder thing to sell before the pandemic, especially in the United States, because a lot of Americans, let's be honest, wear stress as a badge of honor. So, in 2000, we'd all say, oh, well, stress is not a problem. I mean, yeah, we're all stressed out, sure, but we're also functioning well. But I'll be honest with you, Rob, the pandemic has changed all of that. We've all been through the washing machine, and priorities have also shifted. And I think one thing that the world has come to realize is that, feeling stressed out is no longer a badge of honor. It's not always, certainly not always, advantageous to be stressed out. I mean, there is positive stress, but what I mean to say is that I think we've all come to realize the collateral damage on our mental health and our physical health from being stressed. And I'm also, I think, happy to say that we've all had a little bit of an awakening in terms of work-life balance, to say, yeah, I'm willing to be stressed out, but only so much, or only willing to take that so far. My mental health is also important to me. So I hope in this country we've had a little bit of an evolution in terms of our relationship to stress and how stressed we're willing to be before we say, enough is enough.
Well, you bring up such a fascinating point, because I know, especially myself as a psychotherapist and all the people listening as therapists, I think it's been hard we get parents and adolescents, even the parent construct. There's this awareness issue of like, I'm not even sure when it's helpful stress or overstress, or I'm the frog in the boiling water, right? Like and so maybe speak to like, how do we as therapists can even give them a barometer of what's healthy, what's not? How do you know when you're overstressed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's that feels to me like a 1 week intensive workshop to get through all of that. I think about these things in overly simplified terms, but is stress working for our patients, or is it not? right, is are the families that we work with. Maybe some of them may be high octane, high functioning, uh, you know, parents, families, right? The dad or the mom is traveling all the time. They're coming
Mm.
back. They're, throwing the stuff on the table, eating dinner, scarfing dinner. They get, an hour or two of, time with the kids before the kids go down, and then they, sit down for an enjoyable evening, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Reading the news, watching a Netflix show, whatever it is. I think some families thrive on that. And if you really get to the bottom of it, they feel like they have meaning in their life. They feel joyful. They really and truly feel well connected to their children, and to each other as spouses. And it feels right, and they would say that it is right. Other families uh, may say that everything is going well, and then you scratch the surface a little bit, and you realize quite quickly that what they mean is that their work life is going well or whatever it is, but that they don't feel connected to their kids. Their kids don't feel connected to them. If you ask them what their kids have been up to, they wouldn't be able to tell you really. Do they feel connected to their spouse? Do they feel like they really have meaning and passion and joy in life? Do they feel like they're, living their dharma, their purpose in life? It's so, the first answer is yes, everything is honky dory, but once you sort of open the hood, you realize that everything is going awry, and that, they're not really functioning as well as they, maybe initially let on that they were. But also that there's no joy, meaning, passion, connection. Um, and so obviously, I think that's where, as therapists, psychotherapists, myself being included, can help people reconnect with, meaning and joy, and what it is that they feel like they want in their lives.
Well, I really appreciate your giving us this, tying it into one of the litmus tests is this interpersonal relationship and how we're doing with, being connected to our kids, and how we doing that is a really good barometer if I'm hearing you right. What a wonderful thing.
And I think, the COVID pandemic has been the best demonstration of the importance of social connection and belonging that we ever could have imagined, because as we all know, one of the main things the pandemic did is cause complete upheaval of our social and relational lives, right?
Yeah.
We showed up to work every day. We had regular routines, regular roles in our job situations, as did kids, who also showed up to school and had relationships with their teachers and with their peers. And the pandemic, blew all of that up in a matter of months. And I think we're still, quite honestly, reconstituting our social lives. We're just starting to return back to our work environments for some people, and the kids are now back in school, but they have a lot of catch up to do with friends and also with schoolwork. And I think we're still now in that transition period where we're trying to put our social lives back together and really feel grounded. I'm not, well, I should speak again for myself. I don't personally feel there, but I feel like we're getting there again.
Yeah, I appreciate that, especially, I mean, from our business, partial hospitalization and intensive outpatient and these resources, yeah, have been super necessary. Certainly during and after the COVID, it's been fascinating because for lots of kids, returning to schools, it's taken on new meaning. It's been tough. It's been hard to go from COVID to back to life as normal, and they need some supports, which has been really fascinating for us.
Yeah, and there is such a rich literature showing that, major interpersonal stressors are some of the strongest precipitants of almost every major mental health outcome you can think of, including anxiety disorders, depression, psychotic breaks, schizophrenia. Many of first onset psychosis events and even schizophrenia are precipitated by major life events involving high degrees of interpersonal stress. So, um, and that's when people end up in partial hospitalization programs, as you as you well know, and hopefully seek out therapy. So there's a lot there for us to understand.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. Just to go back, because I'd love to ask, and then so you go from Oregon to McLean and working at the Harvard Medical Center. Just so fascinated about that experience.
Yeah, my big trip to the East Coast, was for a clinical internship. And McLean is a fantastic place. One of the best years of my entire life was working at McLean Hospital. If you haven't, if your listeners aren't aware of McLean, it's a fascinating read. Girl Interrupted is all about patients' history at McLean Hospital. It's one of the top 2 or 3 oldest psychiatric hospitals in the country, and has a rich history of seeing some of the most amazing, creative, artistic people that have ever lived. The people at McLean, who are incredible, have some of the deepest understanding of the nature of the human mind, both what it means to function well mentally and psychosocially, and also how people transition from feeling mentally well to where sort of psychopathology develops, and then also to bring sort of the mind back from the state of being psychopathological to being well again. And I think the richest understanding of that line between normal and abnormal thinking, I learned an incredible amount working with the clinicians and the healthcare providers there. So it's was an amazing experience. Yeah, I'll be forever grateful for that. And I think for all therapists, the things that we all hope for is to learn from people always who are much, much better than us, sort of the experts at understanding the mind. And so for me, that was a really incredible experience.
So I would imagine as you're finishing up at your internship at McLean, how is that developing? And boy, what am I going to focus on? How is that shaping? Like, okay, here's what my next step is.
That was 2006. My last year of my internship. And, at that point, fMRI was really only on the scene for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years or so.
Yeah.
And a lot of psychology, clinical psychology, was still very behavioral. I'll use an example from my own work. Like, we were doing interviews, stress interviews with depressed patients, and trying to understand how it was that different life stressors were impacting risk for depression. So, if you're thinking about that in terms of like a mechanistic model, an A to Z kind of story, A is the stressors and Z is the depressive episode. But in between the stressors and the depressive episode are all of the other letters of the alphabet. And, all of those other letters, in my mind, psychology wasn't doing a great job at grappling with, primarily because we didn't yet have the tools. We were just starting to understand how fMRI could be used to image changes in the brain that occur while individuals were depressed or when they experienced a particular type of stressor. So, we were still in the early days of understanding what the neural mechanisms of the impact of stress on depression were. We were still in the early days of, for example, taking blood samples from individuals who were depressed versus non-depressed. There were some people who were doing this work very well, but that really was not adding in the biological piece, was really not where psychology was, in 2000, 2005, 2006. So really, in terms of my own training, what I realized was that if I didn't know anything about biology, then I wasn't going to have a career. Because I had figured we knew at that time kind of as enough as we needed to know that stress was important and that it increased people's risk for depression, but we didn't really know why or how. I looked to see who could teach me something about psychobiology that I thought would be useful for my work. And I found an incredible person who is since retired, but who was at UCSF in San Francisco at the time, Margaret Kemeny, who was clinical psychology by training, but who had retrained in immunology. And I learned about her work, and really what she was doing was trying in her own way to grapple with how stress was impacting the immune system. And then I learned a little bit more of that. And then I learned that the immune system was presumed to be involved in depression. So, and then that for me was voila. So here I know that the immune system is connected to stress. The immune system is connected to depression in some ways. We didn't really fully understand that, but I said, that's who I need to work with. So I came back to the Best Coast. I lived in San Francisco for 2 years, worked with Margaret Kemeny and the other incredible people at UCSF, Nancy Adler and Alyssa Epple and a whole team of other folks, and really just spent those few years trying to understand this field called psychoneuroimmunology, which is a really fancy word for connections between psychology, neuroscience, and immunology. And really what I've been trying to do then is just apply this psychoneuroimmunological perspective to stress and health. And so I suppose that's what I've been doing since then. That's the story.
Well, I appreciate so much knowing the story because there's such a prolific, just deep well of publications and so much stuff that you've done, and to get into that and maybe separate out how do you get into teaching? And I mean, it all goes together, but what leads you in the path of the teaching and all of that stuff, if you don't mind sharing?
It goes back to, I think, your opening comments about early mentors. I mean, if we're so humble to look back on our own lives and to understand how we got into the positions that we did, then hopefully we realize that other people played a great role in all of it. Not just teaching us the content that maybe we're interested in, but as I said in the context of describing my relationship and the impact Phil Zimbardo has had, just more fundamentally making us excited about learning or whatever it is. And so, I've just always been the type of person to want to give away what I've received. I owned at a very early age in my own professional career how much I owed to other people who got me to where I was, And at that time at Stanford, Phil Zimbardo was active, but so was Al Bandura, the father of social cognitive theory and self-efficacy and social modeling. I think I just really came to feel that, if any student in their career has the opportunity to be excited by somebody else, and if that other person can show them how it's done and give them a little bit of a path, a little bit of a kickstart, then they can go pretty far. And I think that my own story is somebody who benefited from other people really taking an interest in me as a scholar. And as I said, not just teaching me some content, but also teaching me how to be excited and passionate about my work. And that was the greatest gift that was given to me. And I suppose feel compelled times 100 to, pay it forward and do the same for my students.
I normally don't say this, but I'm going to say this. You have this wonderful balance. This is why I love to do this podcast, is because you have this beautiful balance of academia and humanism. Like, you're also a human, along with all the amazing work.
So this is also Bandura influence, which is what he would say, we're all agents of change, right?
Yeah.
We are all agents in our own life history, but also in our work. And I think, first of all, taking the agent out of scholarly work would be sort of to try to disassociate two things in a way that doesn't really make sense, right? Because all scholars, poets, any philosophers, musicians, right? Our products are all they're all a product of our mind. So, like, what can we talk about the scholarly work if we're not giving if we're not acknowledging ourselves as agents in that work? So,
yeah, terrific. Wow, thank you so much. So I mean, I just love to know that. So you're teaching and doing this, and then there's, I love to ask this. There's so many amazing publications that you have. I love to ask the question, uh, uh, with such a robust library of publications, what are a few that were most meaningful and why to you? That's probably a loaded question, but
uh, yeah, you're making me choose between my children.
I, well, you've got hundreds of children, so I know that's a tough lot to choose.
Yeah. Um, no, I have a few clear favorites. I mean, one paper, which was an early paper in 2013 about human social genomics that I wrote with a good
Yes.
friend and collaborator of mine at UCLA, Steve Cole. Steve's work has really pioneered our understanding of how the human genome is impacted by different social experiences. And in that first paper, we coined the term of this field that has since come to emerge called human social genomics. And the idea there is sort of more simple than it sounds at first. The idea there is that as we grow up, we come to understand our biological selves as being pretty stable across time and across situations. We all have appreciation of DNA. We know we get sort of half our DNA from our mom and our dad, and that over the course of our lives, that DNA remains relatively unchanged. And of course, we don't experience changes in our DNA from moment to moment because we have no way of experiencing the genome, right? We can feel changes in thoughts and emotions, but we can't feel changes in genomic activity. And the biggest discovery in the field of human social genomics is this idea that the activity, not our DNA, but our RNA levels, the expression of those genes changes on a moment to moment, hour to hour, week to week basis, not just as a function of sort of internal biological processes, but also as a function of our experience of the social world. And for me, that is just a game changer that explains how it is that if we're chronically stressed out for 1 week or 2 weeks, why do we get sick? Why do we come down with a cold the moment after the test is finished? You know what I mean? We've been holding it together for 2 weeks. We're doing well, but during that time, our genome has really reduced our antiviral activity at the level of the genome. We've sort of held it together, but as soon as after we're finished with the test, all of a sudden now we're susceptible to those viruses that we picked up probably along the way. Likewise, how can a life history of chronic stress lead to increased risk of all of these inflammation-related disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, cardiovascular disease, asthma, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease? All of that really is explained by this really critical process of changes in human gene expression occurring as a result of positive and negative social experiences. So that paper certainly, and then just two others I'll mention quickly. We a few years ago wrote a paper which is called a meta-analytic review. Some of your listeners will be aware of. That's when highly masochistic researchers like myself look at the entire literature on a particular topic and try to analyze data across all of those studies. And what we did in that paper was really a meta-analysis of all the studies that had looked at connections between some kind of psychosocial intervention and immune system function. Because the question is, here we are as therapists, we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction. To what end? Do those kinds of interventions have a concrete impact on the function of the immune system? And if so, that feels like pretty concrete empirical evidence to say, yeah, we should use cognitive behavior therapy or dialectical behavior therapy or some kind of stress management to improve both mental and physical health, because we have this demonstrated association in randomized clinical trials that individuals who are randomly assigned to get CBT versus some kind of active control actually show improvements in immune system function. And if we can show that, then, hopefully we can get a little bit more traction for getting payers.
Yeah, that is amazing. Yes. Yes. Wow.
I love that paper because it provides a really robust empirical demonstration that CBT, group CBT, reduces inflammation, has other positive immune benefits, and I feel like that is something that we need in our arsenal of arguments for why payers and insurance companies should cover psychosocial interventions.
So fantastic.
And then the last one is just, what my work has really congealed into, which is the social safety theory, which basically says that, again, as we started out, social relationships are the fabric, that keep us together. Social relationships buttress our lives. They provide us direction, meaning, and really make us feel grounded. And so, whereas positive social relationships can imbue us with resilience and meaning and direction, negative social relationships can degrade our sense of self-worth, can feel as though we're not, moving or progressing in our lives, can make us feel as though we're a flag waving in the wind. And although we're working really hard, there's just something that doesn't feel meaningful about our lives. And so this paper about social safety theories to really try to understand what are the types of positive and negative social experiences that impact our mental and physical health, and also what are the neural and immunologic and genomic mechanisms that translate positive and negative social experiences into health and well-being. And then finally, if we know what those mechanisms are, how can we use therapeutic tools in our toolbox like CBT, DBT, stress management interventions to reduce risk for negative health outcomes, but equally importantly, to build in a positive experience of ourselves and our social world to really keep us resilient at the individual and collective level. And so, that's something that's near and dear to my heart, as you can tell.
Yeah, of course. It's so tremendous. I know you've piqued the interest of not only myself, but all of our listeners. So I want to make sure they gain access to that. I'm smiling at your last description. I'm like, oh, so Martin Seligman was onto something all those many years ago about positive psychology and all that stuff. Just so wonderful. My gosh.
Yeah, and it's, he certainly has had an incredible impact on the field. And I think, to your point, one of the most important impacts I think he had was to remind us all as therapists and as researchers that the goal here is not just to get patients from negative 79 to 0.
Right.
That's disease risk reduction. That's reducing psychopathology. There's also the other end of the scale, which is to get patients from 0 to positive 79 or whatever it is. And I think positive psychology certainly had a huge impact on reminding us that, studying and understanding character and virtue and meaning in life and life satisfaction is just as important as is reducing risk for depression and anxiety, because just eliminating symptoms doesn't mean that you're doing well.
Right. Well, I just here at Embark, we use the term purpose to trump actually passion. So I would say, if it's fair to say for you, there's some clear purpose-driven life here for you, Dr. Slavich. I just thank you for sharing it with us. Holy cow, it's been amazing.
And I suspect that that's nothing special to me. I mean, I think every therapist, you don't become a therapist because you're financially driven, right? You become a therapist because you feel like you have a life that involves giving back and helping to keep other people resilient. So I think I've done that in my own way, but I think that's probably something that resonates with a lot of your listeners as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, would you mind telling us about Your current project, I know that the Stress Lab is doing some amazing things. If you mind sharing that with us, would be wonderful.
Yeah, so you'll probably post this somewhere, but all the work that we're doing is available on our UCLA Laboratory for Stress Assessment and Research, which is at uclastresslab.org. One of the things I'm most excited about is that in the state of California, we've put together this statewide network of stakeholders, clinicians, healthcare providers, scholars, and working on now insurance companies and benefit companies to come together to the table to really address this issue of health disparities and moving toward health equity. And that project is the California Stress, Trauma, and Resilience Network, CalSTAR network for short, also creatively at calstarnetwork.org. And that really, I think, tries to, the goal there is to really to bring the science of stress and resilience to bear on our understanding of what healthcare providers and other stakeholders can do to reduce health disparities at a population level and to hopefully move us a little bit toward health equity. So some of the things we're not really particularly well poised to deal with, the structural issues, being a clinical psychologist or, reducing the structural drivers of racism are, of course, the most, social stratification, are probably the most important things that we can, we could as humans spend our lives doing. The purpose of the network is to focus more on the public health issues related there, which is if we know, for example, that early life adversity or adverse childhood experiences have a huge impact on lifelong trajectories, lifelong opportunity and health disparities, which we know that they do. In the state of California, for example, almost 20% of Californians experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And, over 70% of these health disparities are linked back in one way or another to early life adversity. In the state of California, again, almost $112 million per year, billion dollars per year can be linked to stress-related health outcomes. This is not just the cost of healthcare, but also, lost days of productivity, et cetera. And the focus of the Stress, Trauma, and Resilience Network is really to bring the science of stress and resilience to understand which aspects of the scholarly work in stress and resilience can be used to understand how we can transform healthcare. If healthcare providers do not know what kinds of stressful life experiences their patients have had, then what hope do we have for a healthcare provider to take stress as a treatment target?
Yes.
If you don't assess it, you can't address it. So if you have a patient in your therapy room, who's been traumatized, it's going to be quite difficult to turn those experiences into treatment targets if you don't know that they've been traumatized in one way or another. And so we've developed some tools for assessing lifetime stress exposure along those lines that help, healthcare providers really put major life stressors on the map, on the radar of both patients and providers so that they can work collaboratively to really turn those, those experiences into treatment targets to hopefully, again, not just reduce their disease risk, but, build resilience, hope, resilience, and purpose in their lives.
Well, tremendous. Thank you so much for raising awareness, right? I mean, and I love to hear you say, gosh, the ACEs is an amazing assessment tool to use, even to access that trauma and how it's related to all the related mental health problems and physical problems. Is fascinating in your efforts.
And that ACEs questionnaire, I say tongue in cheek that stressors don't stop when you're age 18. And the ACEs questionnaire has been around for a long time, but we've really taken a life course perspective on that. And your listeners can go to the lab website and look at the tool we've developed, the stress and adversity inventory, or STRAIN, which is really an assessment of lifetime stressors across the entire life course, from early age up until the date of the interview. Because I really do believe that, it is the case that early life adversity is tremendously impactful. But like I said, stress doesn't stop when you're age 18. And in some cases, the things that our patients really come into the room with are things that have happened after that. Most people don't get divorced before age 18, for example. They get divorced after age 18. And so I think it's really important just for all of us as therapists and healthcare providers to understand that life course history of stress.
Just tremendous. I think I know the answer, but I always love to conclude our time together with what legacy will you leave? It's clear you have a legacy to leave and you've got it, but I'm curious to hear a quick response.
Oh gosh. I'm not sure if you think it's going to be psychology related. What I think is that all of us deserve the opportunity to live a life that, marries our personal passion and our occupation. I don't think that I would be as successful of a psychologist if my DNA and my temperament and my own personal experiences didn't provide me with rich information about my work life, if that makes sense. I think I'm good at my work life because I can rely on my personal experiences and my passion. And I think, the legacy that I would love to live is to help as many people as possible, suss out what their personal experiences and their personal passions are. And honestly, if it's in psychology, then I can help a lot because I can help them professionally. But if it's not, I suppose I also really want them to know that, because it's, there's no worse nightmare than to be stuck in a job that when you go home every day, you realize it's not for you. So, I hope to teach as many students about science and psychological science and psychotherapy as possible. But I suppose I also hope that the others fail quickly in psychology and go on into other things. And of course, pursue their passions, whatever it is, in whatever area of life, really maps on most to their, their personal, as you said, personal purpose and meaning. So, helping as many people realize their dharma and pointing them in that direction would be something that I would love to be able to give back.
Well, you've given me a gift in our time together. You certainly have given the readers a gift. Thank you for this really living and exemplifying this integrated life, if you will. That's certainly what I like to call it. So just invaluable. We will certainly be able to, your website and all that, we'll certainly post it on there. I want to thank you so much for your time. I've got a million more questions, but I'll refrain from doing that. But to our listeners, just thank you for joining us. Please access this podcast wherever how you access podcasts would be wonderful. And again, I want to just extend my deepest gratitude for spending time with Dr. George Slavich. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.